Welcome to our session on monitoring AKS. I'm Ryan McLean, a tech evangelist at Datadog. I've spent almost 20 years in the industry, concentrating primarily on automation and monitoring. Before joining Datadog, I ran production workloads in AKS on Azure and managed cloud-based fleets of web-scale servers and databases for IoT products. Today, we're going to cover four main things: monitoring, dashboarding, logs, and drilling down into all three. I also want to make sure you know we will have demos. Here's the infrastructure that we'll be deploying. Note that for this I use Terraform, but the repo will also have Azure Resource Manager templates ready to go and a one-click deploy to Azure button. This is obviously an oversimplification, but the primary things we're deploying are the VNet, which contains our two subnets, one for Windows nodes and one for Linux nodes, but note that the resources are targeting East US, and you can edit that, of course. I'll do a brief demo of the web-based deployment process so you can get a feel for it. Note that the examples in this webinar are from a different branch, but this workflow might be handy in cases where you'd like the team to be able to quickly stand up and tear down AKS clusters in order to test changes with a rapid feedback cycle. All right, so basically it's a quick overview of the repo. So it's my name /AKS_infra. And going through here kind of describes what I just said, like the VNet, et cetera, et cetera. But what we can do is click that deploy to Azure button. And what this will do is actually load the ARM template. And using the ARM template, we can go through a form in order to set up the resources. Now, if you want to create a new resource group, we've got that covered. If you want to pick one that you've already got, no problem. Note that you do need to change the location. I use DCUS, use your own. It will set up a service principal ID and secret. I just picked some random ones here. And that you'll need to change the OS disk size prior to proceeding. So once that's done, you can just click next. And that will actually start deploying the resources for you. Now, once the resources are deployed and Datadog's deployed with it, this is kind of a spoiler, but you'll get this dashboard out of the box. Note that I'm using a white background on this dashboard, but we support both light and dark backgrounds, so you can use the one that you prefer. This is all accomplished out of the box using the dashboards that we've already created for you once Datadog is installed in AKS. Now, logging metrics and tracing are supported with pre-configured dashboards as mentioned. This means you can get started in minutes. And now I time myself from start to finish. It took about 20 minutes to integrate Azure, set up an AKS cluster, and get results into Datadog. We're going to be talking about monitoring three things: logs, traces, and metrics. We monitor metrics in order to get details about actions taking place in your app. It can be app metrics, business metrics, or a combination of both. Logs give us details about the errors, but can also surface info about the app itself, any lifecycle events like stop, start, new deployments, or debugging. Finally, traces can help us correlate between services, as well as drill down into those errors and delays. If you don't already have an AKS cluster deployed, the repository on GitHub that I demoed earlier can be run in your Azure account. If you want to just deploy it, click the Deploy to Azure button like in the demo, and that's it. Just a quick note that the code we're using today is from the Datadog Kubernetes training series. I've set up a quick infrastructure as code repo, and it's a good place to start in terms of looking at a full microservice app from start to finish. The steps to get your own version of this demo up and running with the modifications are as follows: clone the GitHub repository, make any modifications to the code that you'd like. For example, create Terraform variables files or update the ARM template, what have you. Then you can deploy to Azure using either the CLI or using Azure DevOps, GitHub Actions, what have you. This is pretty straightforward, which makes talking about the monitoring pretty easy. It's an e-commerce app with a front end and a back end. It's written in Ruby, JavaScript, and Python, and uses Git to track code changes. We use Azure CLI for management. Once we've got the app deployed, we can then set up synthetics to hit the website and perform actions and compare the results over time. So you can see that we're doing it for this site. We've got an SSL test, HTTP test, browser test, all that kind of stuff. We're going to be concentrating on the browser test. So imagine the synthetic browser would hit your site, and as it's hitting the site, could do things like take screenshots, figure out if your deployment's failed, if there's anything going wrong, that kind of thing. So what we're doing is a checkout test, and we're going to hit the site from 3 locations with 1 device type every 5 minutes. It's got 131 tests, so it's quite a bit. And if there's an error, we've got an error message here that we'll send out using your default alert profile. So in our case, it says, hey, the checkout's not working, but it could be something else. Now, you can also see that we've got uptime here. So we can see that for the past 7 days, it hasn't been so good. So as we've been deploying, we've been seeing a lot of errors. So we've got things like time to interactive by location and device. We've also got time duration. So what we can do is, as we're hitting the site, take screenshots, and using those metrics, we can see how long it took as we were browsing the site to go through the checkout process. So for example, like an easy one was 2.8 seconds, which does seem to be a little bit long. You might want to drill down into it. But as we'll scroll through, we can see that there are some that are taking even longer. Now, it could have been that we were deploying while we were testing, which is possible. This is our test environment. It could also be that there's something that we need to look at in terms of the app speed. So if we notice that over time, as we're deploying, we notice that things are pretty slow. Like this one's 14.3 seconds, not great. We also got another one down here that's 9.7 seconds. We'll probably want to drill down into that chairs or light fixtures area to figure out what's happening. Now, at the end, we've also got the test results. So we can see how many steps were completed and what was going on. So if we've got one here that's only completed 10 out of 132, maybe there's something going on during that time. Same thing, we've got another one here that's 10 out of 132. So maybe we want to drill down into those in order to figure out what's actually happening. Now, similarly, we can also use RUM, real user monitoring, to look at real-time and historical sessions once the app is instantiated in a user browser. So again, we're going to go into the shopping site. And what we're going to do is drill down by country and then by country by browser. So what we want to do is look at these Samsung internet sessions from India to figure out if maybe we need to target different things in different areas to optimize the website for different users. So if we've got a bunch of users or a significant amount of users in India hitting our cart using Android tablets, maybe we want to start optimizing our site for that profile. So what we can see here is like when the site loaded on that Android tablet in India, we can actually see how long it took on their end to load resources. So we can see the fonts may have been a little bit slow, but JPEGs were actually pretty bad. So over half a second for all 4 of these. And similarly, there's a couple more fonts down here. They're just under half a second. And though these are loading in parallel for those resources, the site itself is loading some things sequentially. So what we can do is start looking into those different resource types. And from those resource types, figure out which is slower, which is faster, what might need to be optimized. So what we're doing is here is looking at long tasks. And for these long tasks, you get a lot of tags. So again, we can see India, tablet, Android, but also we can start to get major tags like what version of Android, what exact type of tablet, where in India was it, what was the IP, what exact URL were they hitting at the time, and then on our end correlating, hey, were we doing a deployment at the time, were we doing testing, was something else happening in the background that can give us more information about that run session. So it's a lot of visibility from the front end. So once we've deployed our cluster and our app on top of the cluster, we can already get started in testing and then iterate through different cluster sizes or types or what have you. So once we've got that set up, what we probably want to do is automate our deployment process. So in Azure DevOps, you can add Kubernetes clusters as targets. And using those clusters, you can start doing things like build container images. You can deploy on commit. You can deploy metrics back to Datadog. And then you can gate deploys based on metric values. So what do I mean by that? So out of the box, once you've integrated Azure DevOps with Datadog, what you get is quite a bit of information. Again, this is a default dashboard. You may want to modify it, and we'll talk about how you might want to surface some of this data and put it into a different dashboard. But right off the top, on the left-hand side, you can see successful builds, releases completed, work items completed, work items created, that kind of thing, so you can check your ratio. The other thing you can do is get stats on your builds, your releases, and your event stream. We're going to talk about the event stream a little bit later, but first, let's touch on gating. So if you'd like to set up a gate, that's a condition that needs to be satisfied prior to deployment. We support that too. So let's say we're deploying to Kubernetes, but the cluster is not healthy. So we just upgraded from say 1.18 to 1.19 on AKS. And we want to make sure that the cluster is healthy prior to deploying. Now, if we know the cluster is not healthy, there's no sense deploying if we know it'll fail, right? So we can set up a check in Azure DevOps to make sure that our cluster is healthy and only then deploy it. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the Datadog and AKS integration. So setting up Datadog to monitor your Azure infrastructure is a 3-part process. First, set up a service account. So similar to what we did in our deployed Azure button. Then give that service account read-only access to your sub. And then finally add the service account to Datadog. Note that we're talking about a public beta, but the Kubernetes operator from Datadog allows you to install our cluster agent, node agents, and cluster check runners from a single manifest. And as you'll see, the installation is very straightforward. This is primarily due to Operator Hub. So first what we'll do is we'll install the Operator Lifecycle Manager, OLM. Then we install the operator. The last step is to deploy the Datadog manifest to our cluster. So what we'll go over is a quick demo of what that looks like. So I've scripted it up. I figured I might as well show you what that script looks like. So you can do all of this from Azure Shell. In our case, once the cluster is deployed, all we need to do is get the credentials for that cluster. Again, this is our US default AKS dev cluster. So what we're going to do is get those credentials and use those credentials in order to run an operator deploy. And what that will do is grab down the operator lifecycle manager, deploy that to a cluster, and then we'll piggyback on top of that to start deploying Datadog. Now, this takes about 2 minutes. I'll skip it because it's honestly a white text on a black screen. But basically, once you've got this all deployed, what you can do is start getting info into Datadog and go from there. So that was a lot of info, but I want to do a quick recap before we dive into the next session. The main thing I want to get across is that it takes minutes to set up the Azure to Datadog integration. And similarly for your first Kubernetes cluster, and as you may have seen, the same applies to the Datadog Kubernetes operator. We support standard configs, and most of what you need is ready to go out of the box. Now, let's circle back a little bit and talk about dashboards. So you've probably used this type of dashboard before, one where you collect all the metrics together, have the time all synced up, but you can drill down if you need it. We've done a lot of the legwork to make it so that you can get a good starting point for your integrated services in Azure, and Kubernetes AKS is no exception. The default dashboard has most of what you need right there. As we showed earlier, you can see Kubernetes events, kubelet info, resource usage, graph network stats, dig into CPU, memory, disk, and utilization. If you've used Datadog Kubernetes monitoring before, you've probably come across this built-in dashboard. And the nice thing is it applies to AKS. So if you haven't, you're in luck. We'll do a quick tour before we dive in. So here you can see the high-level metrics, events per node, events themselves, kubelets up and down, kubelet health and ping, and infrastructure stats per host for pods and containers. Drilling down a bit on the right-hand side of the built-in dashboard, we've got running and stop containers, a graph of containers by pod, as well as utilization per node. Finally, we can drill down to the Kubernetes components, daemon sets, deployments, pods, replica sets, and containers themselves, ordered by state over time. So this is a lot to take in at once, and you might not need it all right away, but this is done out of the box as soon as you get our agent running. Of course, it doesn't end there. We're with you along your journey. As you venture into Kubernetes controllers, we've got a dashboard for that too. All right, so in terms of customization, your first step will be to clone that dashboard that we just talked about, and then start adding in any other useful info that you might find handy. So for us, what we're going to do, again, 3-step process, we're going to clone the default dashboard, add metrics for our Azure dependencies, and then share it out to the team. So we'll go over setting up your dashboard. We'll take the default dashboard, duplicate it, add some of that relevant info, and share it out. Okay, so once you get into Datadog, what you can do is hit the dashboards and click on all integrations. What that will do is show you these canned dashboards, the ones that are set up and ready to go. Now you can see here we've got Azure App Service, Azure DevOps. We're going to go into Azure DevOps, get a look at the metrics that we saw before, and figure out maybe if one of these is handy for us to look at. So there's a lot of builds and things like that. There's an event timeline. Maybe what we want to do is have a look at something like the events that we talked about earlier on the right-hand side. So I want to grab this little graph and take that graph and move it into ours. So what I'm going to do is grab the code from that graph. So I'm going to quickly clone this dashboard so I can make it my own. And once I've done that, I'm actually going to sort of take parts of that and then merge that in with the Kubernetes dashboard that we'll use to monitor AKS and put them together. So what that will do is allow me to do things like get the stats of my deployments for my cluster specific to my cluster and show me the cluster and the deployments at the same time so I can correlate the two. So what I'm going to do here is grab this entire query, and I'll take this query and then add it to that dashboard. Now, I will say recently we've made it so you can actually copy these directly and move them over. And that makes it really handy if you want to grab a couple of them, for example, as opposed to just one. In this case, we only wanted the events, so it's easier just to grab that. So again, I'm going into all integrations, and what I'm going to do is type in Kubernetes. You can see as I type it, it filters the list. We're going to go into Kubernetes overview, and again, we're going to clone this dashboard, and once it's cloned, we can start adding in things that are more useful to our team. So our team's using Azure DevOps. We want to add some of that in here so that we can deploy to it. So again, clone the dashboard, give it a name. I'm using greater than RM, lesser than, just so that I can see, or sorry, lesser than and then greater, just so I can see it at the top of the list. You can name it whatever you want. In this case, what we'll do is we'll see that on the right-hand side, there is a bit of a gap there. So we've got a good spot to add things in. So if I click edit widgets, what I can do is go through these lists and figure out which one of these, like is it a heat map, an image map, what have you, which one of these fits the bill for what we're trying to do. So what we were looking at before was an event stream. We'll add another event stream in. So I'm just going to paste in that query that I had that will drill right down into my project name to get me deployments on Azure DevOps that are specific to my cluster. So you can see here that I'm grabbing all the Azure DevOps ones, but we can further filter in if we wanted to. In this case, we're going to show events, but we're going to give it a name. So they're Azure DevOps events. And then when I click done here, it will make a small icon. I'll move it around a little bit. But basically, this applies to anything. So if you had something like Cosmos DB, for example, if you're relying on that, or maybe you're using a blob store, or perhaps you're using something like Azure SQL in the cloud, and your cluster actually relies on these resources, and you want to start correlating between them in one dashboard, this is how you do it. So you can mix and match between those canned dashboards, those ones that we've pre-built for you, and start making something relevant for your team so you can get a single dashboard. Now, once you've made a dashboard and customized it, the first thing you'll probably want to do is start sharing it out. So what you can do is you can publish like a URL that is specific to a time frame, for example, if you need to show another team, like it's just this time frame, or if you need to scope it for just this cluster, you can do that. So you can do things like say, hey, just the past hour, or maybe allow people to change the time frame that it's for, or if you want to do it for just one cluster, or maybe even just one tag. So if it's just like the development environment, the test environment, production environment, that kind of thing, you can start going down to the tags and do it that way. Now, let's quickly go over logging. I'll show you how you can pivot to them in the tracing demo. So there are two ways we can grab logs from Kubernetes, via the Docker or container socket, or via the Kubernetes logs themselves. So once integrated, you've got access to the full logs, no samplings in place. A quick demo of that. I know talking about logs probably isn't very interesting, but seeing it in action is a lot more practical. All right, so here's a quick overview of the log. So what we're doing is we're looking at containers, and all these containers are deployed into Kubernetes. What we're looking at is our Kubernetes nodes. So we can see all these agent pools. So these are basically Kubernetes nodes that are part of AKS clusters. And when we're looking at these containers themselves inside of the cluster, we can start to get details about what's going on in them. But also, when we're looking at these details, we can start seeing live tail of what's going on in them. So you don't need to start attaching to nodes. You can start looking at pods and clusters and getting a live tail of your logs as things are going through. So while I was recording this, basically there was traffic coming through telling us like, hey, it's hitting Rails, and that's going from Rails into Mongo. And what I can do is right from the container view, looking at the logs, I can pivot into my logs themselves. And as I'm going through these logs, I'm getting these logs for that specific container ID. And you can see that it's that agent that I was looking at, that agent pool node that I was looking at. And if I only want to see the errors, I can start filtering through them. So we were looking at the past 15 minutes, but if you want to get something relevant, like let's say this container just launched, for example, how do I know how long it's been up for and what's actually happening? And we can see here that there's actually some issues. So there's an issue with the payment saying that it's been called too many times a minute. And it looks like it's been hitting so many times that there's an issue. But also note that some of these logs were redacted. So for example, we didn't want to record the email address, so we dropped that. So in our logs ingest, we actually can drop fields that are sensitive for you as we go through. Now, for the last section, I want to cover drilling down into your traces and logs in order to correlate events and spans. So I'm going to read from the slide. I'll try to make it quick. Like basically, you can correlate between logs and traces. The manual instrumentation is also possible for customized spans, and full distributed APM tracing using automatic instrumentation can be enabled. So the way we do this in Magic is using trace IDs. So we can use those trace IDs to pivot between events and logs and then drill down. So for the last couple of demos, I'll try to wrap it all together. So this is a sample of traces, logs, and events all together, and a mixture of real traffic and synthetic tests against a live cluster. All right, so this is our app service view. So this is kind of showing all of our microservices running at the same time. So you can see that we've got stuff deployed all over the place. We've got some stuff with Azure Arc, we've got stuff in other clouds, we've got things in AKS, you can AD server, you can add server, get some payment APIs, that kind of thing. What we're going to do is start drilling into these and start looking at these red ones that are having errors and figuring out what's going on. So using this web store, for example, how can we figure out what's actually happening? So our auth.net is going to the web API, but the web API is having issues. So can we drill down into that to give us a little bit more info? So we've got the web store having issue. You can see our Shopify web client is talking to our ad server and our email server. But a lot of these are red, so that means that there are issues. So let's figure out if we can drill down into like our ad server and figure out maybe if this is the source of what's happening. So what we're going to do is drill into this app analytics, and then we'll start drilling into what's running in here to figure out what's currently happening. And you can see all the requests are coming through. So we've got a bunch of gets and posts in here, but we're also getting a fair amount of 500s and 502s. And in our code itself, what we can do, because we've instrumented it, we can actually start looking at the actual request. So we've got like a browser request is calling our Rails rack request, which is then calling Express, but we're having issues here calling Redis. And it looks like because we've supplied too many parameters to our get command. And this could be like a failed deploy. So we deployed some new code and we added too many arguments. Because of that, we're not calling Redis properly. What's interesting is that we can not only drill into just that service and those traces, we can start correlating between those traces for different services. So did that deploy have other services that came with it? Or was this specifically this service that we deployed that's having issues? And again, from here, we can drill right down into trace IDs, and from those trace IDs, start seeing instances. So again, we can start drilling into our instances and seeing the logs that are relevant for this to figure out what's going on. So we went all the way from our services into our app, from our app to our log, and our traces. All right, so next up, if you haven't signed up for Datadog, you can sign up for a 14-day trial from the Azure Marketplace, and then set up the operator in your AKS cluster to get started.